We just finished talking about UI as they start talking about the things they had to work on to get the game into a more playable state going into A Realm Reborn. And now we're about to start talking about the battle system.
でもう一つはバトルシステムをとにかく変更しないとコンテンツが作れない。つまりあまり良くないバトルシステムをベースにして、コンテンツを作ったとしてもコンテンツが面白くならない。だから順番としてはインターフェースを修正しながらバトルシステムを変更してやっとその先にコンテンツを作るっていうのが、順番としては僕は真っ当だと思った。当時のバトルシステムも当時は15人でパーティーが組めてあって、でしかもマジックポイント MP の管理っていうものがほぼなかったので、当時のファイナルファンタジー14の中で最強の回復魔法だったケアルガーっていうスペルをずっと連打してても MP がゼロにならない。延々ケアルガーして OK で、他の魔法いらないよね。じゃあとにかく当時は15人で一つのモンスターを殴りまくって回復しまくってっていうすごい大雑把なゲームだったので、これを戦略的なバトルシステム計算式に変えていかないとコンテンツが面白くならない。だから UI を直しながらバトルシステムを変更して、でそれらの準備をしながら最も重要だと思ってたのはファイナルファンタジーエレメントっていうものをとにかく入れていくことっていうのが次のというか最も大きな課題だっていうふうに思ってました。なぜなら当時ジョブもなかった、ナイトもいない、ブラックメイジもいない、ホワイトメイジもいない。これはファイナルファンタジーなのか。チョコボに乗れるわけでもないし、イフリートは出てきてるけど戦えないし、一体何なんだこのゲーム。だから僕らがコンテンツとして入れていかなきゃいけなかったのはやっぱりイフリートやそのガルーダ、いわゆる召喚獣って。
I do think that there's something about, like, if you're gonna be a Final Fantasy game, right? You've got to have access to iconic things. So, like, if MMOs have mounts, why would we not ride chocobos? If we're going to fight things, why would we not fight summons like other Final Fantasy games, kind of, right? Like, how do we, you've got to make this, the online game, in my opinion, naturally positions itself as kind of the pinnacle, the catch-all, where somebody plays a game and says, wow, I want to share this with other people, and they say, hey, I have great news, there's this multiplayer version of this game. So I think Final Fantasy Online as a concept positions itself to very, very, very naturally be kind of the theme park, you know, the Lego world, the Disney world, the place that we go after we're already invested. Now, it should not be required that you've done those other things. So you have the ability for people to come into Final Fantasy XIV as their first ever Final Fantasy game, but you definitely don't want to be turning away an existing base when you put the name on the door, when you put marquee, you know, right there in the marquee, you have Final Fantasy printed. And so when people go, oh my gosh, I love Final Fantasy, you definitely want those people to feel welcome. Not to the point where it makes people feel like, oh, I don't play Final Fantasy, I'm not welcome there. But definitely to the point where they're not passing you by. And so not having a lot of these things that now we are like, well, that's so obvious, does feel like a good place to start from a content perspective.
一般的に呼ばれているものとのボスバトルを入れていかなきゃいけないと思ったし、チョコボに乗れないなんて MMO なのに話にならないからチョコボにちゃんと乗れるようにしなきゃいけないし、何よりジョブがないのも FF じゃない。少なくとも僕は FF だと思わないので、だったらジョブをちゃんと入れていこうっていうところが、でもそれもやっぱりさっき言ったようにインターフェースとバトルシステムが直ってなければいいものにはならないので、だから回収をやりながらきちんと仕様を作ってそれを一つずつクリアしていくっていうのを中盤以降は続けて、そこからやっぱりグッドゲームの評判はやっぱりQ14も良くなっていってプレイヤーもずっと増え続けていったので、少しずつですけど、あれは僕らもすごい励まされましたね。やっぱりちゃんと面白いものを作っていけばみんなプレイをしてくれるっていうのも数字の上からもよく見えたので、当時の7つ一気にリリースされた7つのジョブ、パッチナンバー忘れちゃったけど7つのジョブがいっぺんに実装されたんですけど、 たった一人のゲームデザイナーが作ったんで。
The team had their sights set on what needed to be changed.
Oh, those are moments where like you look back and you're like, that's crazy. You're there then and you don't think about it, but there's moments later where you look back and you're like, that was such a bad idea. It worked out. They're fond stories, but it's crazy to think that they were doing that much relying on one person.
And how they were going to do it. For the first time in years, they were feeling hopeful, and even better, players were finally starting to respond with positivity. But right as they were settling into this new reality and finding their rhythm, disaster struck. For 6 minutes, Japan shook. A 9.0 earthquake had struck 200 miles northeast of Tokyo, and a resulting tsunami devastated coastal regions. What followed was a humanitarian and infrastructural disaster that can be barely comprehended. While the country rallied to help those affected, Tokyo suffered aftershocks and frequent electrical blackouts. I asked Yoshida-san if he'd like to share how this had affected the team.
まあ東京もそうは言ってもすごい揺れたので、やっぱりまあ当日はね、会社に泊まった方が安全だって言って帰らないでずっとニュースを見てるっていう人たちもいたし、やっぱり東北に家族とかね親戚とかいるスタッフも当然いたので、まあもう正直言うともう開発どころではなかったのは確かにそうですね。で開発なんか優先すべきじゃないと思うので、やっぱりみんな開発者の前に人なので。
It's hard to remember the history of how one thing is going on at the same time as something else. You know, you go back and you look up what year a game was developed and go look at who the top star in Hollywood was. Go look up what natural disasters happened that year. Go look up who was president at the same time in whatever, or, you know, the head of whatever government in whatever country you live. Go look up what medical advancement was made that year. And it's hard to kind of correlate those. It's something that I think history classes take on, is this kind of cumulative narrative. But even then, like, they can't get to everything. It's hard to think about things like that impacting. It's hard to think about the wildfires of California affecting a lot of the game dev studios here in the US that have been California based over the years. Here in Texas, right, as we see more game studios based here, there have always been some here, but as we see that, you know, the winter storm affected us really seriously this last year. And, you know, to people that live in cold climates where their power grid is winterized, they're like, I don't understand why you guys are having such issues. But then you turn around and you see the Pacific Northwest really struggling with heat that our system is much more equipped to handle. It's hard to think about this because these are people. These are people. And it's interesting to think about this as a contextual thing. And you don't want that to take away from it, right? This last year, we found out that Soken had been working on the game while fighting cancer. And on one hand, you want to thank him for that sacrifice. On the other hand, you want to be very careful to not imply that anybody who doesn't want to or have the ability to do their job while on cancer means they don't care about their job, or they're not passionate, or, you know, that their job's not as important. You don't want to imply that anybody who works on their job and cares for it can't care as much because they didn't have cancer. You don't want to be in some weird I'm cheering for cancer type position. And so it's hard to separate them, but like context is something that a lot of times gets lost. You know, talking back to the winter storm, the state of Texas as a state owns less than a dozen snowplow trucks, and it was revealed that some of them were literally waiting on parts and weren't working, and they just weren't in a hurry to fix them. We don't have that. And so people are like, well, I don't understand how a little bit of snow tears you guys up so bad. The amount of snowplow trucks we have is enough to plow the highways that link our military bases. They are there as a national security measure, not a maintain the population measure. It's it's hard to think of these contextual things. So when you think of Japan getting hit by an earthquake, that's not something that I think of. When I look at where I went to college and where I went to high school, and I think back to these moments like September 11th, or here in Texas, I think back to moments like Katrina. These are moments that defined the way the cities I live in and around acted and behaved. And so you look at these decisions like, oh, I left a job, or I went to school then, or whatever. And I look at natural disasters that literally affected where and when I went to college. And I look at, you know, these opportunities. I look at people in my parents' generation that their careers were determined by things like the draft. And it's hard to remember that while there was something that was already monumental going on at Square Enix, that there is a world outside of that building. Because we weren't in it, right? A huge number of us here that speak English and play this game will never go to Japan, and yet there is no shortage of people who are ready to tell you what Japanese culture is like and the differences between a Japanese dev and a Western dev. And, you know, we can make these huge summaries of how they are, those over there. And it's just people. And I think this last year has exposed a lot of it as we've come out of COVID and we've had a chance to see something that more unilaterally affected the whole world. Not equally, but entirely. A chance to see what happens when multiple companies in the same industry suffer from the same supply and logistics shortages. What happens when multiple cities in the same country are struggling, and, you know, unlike when a localized natural disaster, something like an earthquake or a tornado or a flood, affects one city and the adjacent cities can offer resources, there was a little bit of everybody for themselves during COVID because everybody was struggling, and so there wasn't any resilience in the system to kind of reach out and help a neighbor because everybody was struggling. And I think it's easy to look back on Final Fantasy and forget what was happening in the world at the time. It's one of my favorite parts of gaming, is that we get a chance to log into a world and step away from this one. No matter how good or bad my real life is, Eorzea is in its own state. And I like that. But the people who work on Eorzea, they're out here with us.
まあ日本中電力が足りなくなっていたので、まあ本当に些細なのかもしれないけど、サーバーを全部落とそう、まあ少しでも協力できることがあればっていうことで、プレイヤーの皆さんにも申し訳ないんですけど、サーバーを一定期間止めますっていう話をして、そんな時期でしたね。ただサーバーの稼働を再開してからプレイヤーの方からまあお手紙をいただいたりしたんですけど、エオルゼアの中で遠くにいる友達の無事が確認できた、エオルゼアがあったから電話も通じない、連絡の手段がなかったところ、エオルゼアの中にログインしてきてくれたことで無事だったっていうのが分かった。逆にその周りの人たちの情報っていうのも分かったっていうお話をいくつかいただいて、まあ電力が足りなければね、当然そのサーバーなんて落とせばいいかなと思うんですけど、そうじゃない限りは続けるっていうことも、エオルゼアを維持しておくっていうことも一つのなんかこうサポートなのかなって思った機会でもありましたね、その時は。だから続けてくれてありがとうって言われたんですよ、ファイナルファンタジー14。開発で、まあ、あとは最も大きかったのは、実はイフリートの次に戦うボスはリヴァイアさんの予定で、リヴァイアさんをかなりの速度で作ってたんですけど、とてもじゃないけどリリースなんかできないっていう話で、だからイフリートの後モーグリが実装されているのはそれが理由ですね。急いでモーグリを作り直したというか企画。
Oh man, that is such interesting timing. I will tell you, they do tackle real world things head on. Last winter they had a heavy influence of COVID on the winter event. It actually at the time made me really mad because I wanted the escapism he's talking about right now. When I hop off and I open up my phone or I call a family member or I go to work, I can't go more than 5 minutes without COVID coming up. And when I log into 14, I can, and I go to do this seasonal event, which is supposed to be these joyful things that I look forward to that are even separate me from the rest of the content. And there it was right in my face. And it's limited time, so I can't be like, well, I'll just do it later. If I want to get it done, I have to do it now because it doesn't come back. And I remember being really angry with 14. I remember not wanting to play for several days. I remember feeling hurt that they came in and invaded something of mine, my ownership, my viewpoint, my tiny little corner of Eorzea, my gameplay experience. And it's their game, right? I'm just a visitor in their world, but I remember feeling really, really mad. So, you know, when you think about the Leviathan timing with a flood, and you think about this, like, I play these games with escapism absolutely as a high modifier of it, or as a high contributing reason, and it can be really, really frustrating when that gets shattered.
し直したので、いやそんなことはなかったですよ。みんなやっぱりそれぞれのそのあの時期会社に来れない人たちも何日か会社も休みにしてるんで、ただどっちかっていうとその自分たちにできることをやろうっていうみんな感じだった。そうじゃあ全員で福島に行って何か僕らが活動することって意味があるのか、あれだけたくさんの人たちが押しかけてる中で、だったら僕らはそのなんだろう、彼らが落ち着いた時にゲームを楽しく遊べるように、僕らは結局ゲーム作るしか脳がないので、ゲームを作り続けるのが結局何よりなのかもっていう、こういう。
I think post-COVID, this statement has a lot more context around it. Obviously, locally, the devs and the communities around it know what this game means and what it means to people that were affected by that. But it's hard to picture it here, right? You know, World of Warcraft had a time where they went through a similar set of events when wildfires were in Irvine, California. But, you know, the United States is enormous. And so there are many Americans that will never set foot in California. And so it's easy to distance yourself from it. It's easy to remember. I mean, we have time zones that span our country. Multiple. And so it's easy to forget that, you know, I can drive 10 or 12 hours at full highway speeds and still be inside my own state. And so it's easy to have regional things like this be something where you distance yourself. But this concept of we make video games and what does that offer to the world? I mean, it's just a game, right? It's just a game. But these games bring us together. They can offer a way of processing things at a lower stakes part of the world. I think when I look to games, it helps me explore concepts that I might be uncomfortable exploring in the world. It's the importance of a close friend group when you can explore concepts politically and ethically and morally, where you're saying, hey, I was having this thought, and you can bounce it off a friend and say, hey, that's not really how you're supposed to think, man. Like that's an inappropriate joke, or that's a really rude thought, or you're not thinking about how that impacts somebody else. And in a game, I can explore those things. Yoshida talked earlier about having two characters in Ultima, one where you could be this gentleman and the other where you could go around killing other players. You don't explore that part of yourself in the real world. And so I think games is a place that I can explore parts of myself that I maybe don't even have interest in exploring in real life, because I know what they would do to the parts of me that I don't want to change. I know what they would do to the people around me and the people that it affected, and I don't want the negatives that come with it. But in the gaming world, I can explore the part of that idea that I find intriguing without all of the cost associated with it. And so I think there's something about gaming that can be, I think cathartic is the word. I think that's the word. I think you used the right word. I think there is something there that allows me to explore. And so when we talk about things like politics and medicine and all that, I was mad because it hit something I was already having to explore in the real world with the COVID event. But there are other ideas that I'm really thankful that Final Fantasy tackles. When we talk about concepts like free will, when we talk about, within Final Fantasy XIV alone, you can talk about things like sex trafficking, you can talk about slavery, you can talk about human rights violations against men, women, and children. You can talk about all sorts of issues that have to do with this life and the next, and at a geopolitical scale all the way down to an intimate parent and their children type relationships, lovers. And so within the story of 14, you can tackle really adult ideas for the fact that it's not an M-rated game. It's one of the things Yoshida said that he excited him about 16 is that he can tackle these directly on screen instead of having to think of creative ways to deal with this. But there are a lot of very, very adult ideas inside 14 just beyond the veil, right? Just around the curtain. They can't show them on screen because this is a game played by kids and it's not rated for that, but they're there if you're looking for them, much like watching the movie Shrek or something like that. There are adult concepts being tackled on screen. And I appreciate that because it gives you a chance to explore those ideas in a really low-stakes environment, right? To explore what happens when one group of people doesn't tolerate another simply because they're different. And go through that and try to empathize, and it's not affecting you in the real world. And so you can go way further left and way further right to explore the completeness of the idea, without having to just walk out into the streets and say things that you don't feel fully aware of. I think that it allows you to tackle things that hopefully you never relate to in the real world. When you talk about words like murder or all the way up to genocide, when you talk about words like abuse, while it is a sad reality that those take place in the world, hopefully we do everything we can to make sure that future generations ideally have no idea of what that is to experience. We work very, very hard to make sure that the generations that come after us ideally will know less of that pain and hurt than we did, and that we will know less than those that came before us. And I think games like this are a chance to explore those topics. So I think this conversation here has a lot more context now than it did when this documentary was released.
っていう話はしなかったですけど、みんなそういう感じで復帰してきてましたよ、仕事に。